The art of blacksmithing originated around 1500 BC, when people first started smelting iron and using it to craft tools. Though the first iron tools were rather crude and brittle by today's standards, they were a vast improvement over the copper and bronze tools that preceded them. Tools and other products crafted by blacksmiths remained of a fairly low quality for hundreds of years until humans came to have a better understanding of metallurgy and the scientific properties of iron. To smelt iron, blacksmiths originally used bloomeries, which were small furnaces fueled by charcoal and supplied with oxygen using a bellows. The combination of charcoal and the bellows allowed the furnace to reach temperatures hot enough to smelt iron ore and yield iron that blacksmiths could then turn into tools and weapons. Iron could be used straight from the bloomery, or could be processed further into other types of iron, with their own strengths and weaknesses, such as pig iron, cast iron, and wrought iron. Pig iron is formed by pouring molten iron into a sand-based mold, where it hardens into easily manageable shapes. Pig iron had a high carbon content and was subsequently brittle and not very good for hammering. Cast iron referred to any piece of ironwork that was formed by pouring molten iron into a cast of the desired object, hence its name. Wrought iron referred to iron taken directly from the bloomeries and worked on. It was almost completely free from carbon and other impurities, and was generally worked on by hand because of how malleable it was. Virtually all wrought iron products today are actually made of steel, though. Besides being the sole producer of iron objects such as tools, weapons, silverware, nails, and horseshoes, the blacksmith was one of the most educated members of the town and was called upon to perform many important services related to the items that they produced. Most blacksmiths would have had at least a basic understanding of metallurgy, since they needed to understand the scientific properties of the metals that they worked with. In addition to crafting things out of metal, blacksmiths were also skilled in repairing tools and other objects, making them a vital member of any town. Since they usually produced horseshoes for the town, it was common for blacksmiths to install and repair horseshoes, and a separate trade known as farriery eventually branched off of blacksmithing. Farriers specialized in making and installing horseshoes, and generally knew more about horses than their blacksmith counterparts.
The art of blacksmithing has evolved and branched out in many different ways during its thousands of years of existence. Modern-day blacksmithing, which I will be discussing, is no longer just means of creating weapons and armor, and goes much beyond the creation of simple metal tools. I've split it into 3 different types of smithing, each with a different purpose, different tools, and different people, but all using the shaping or machining of metal in one way or another. I'll be discussing blacksmithing in the traditional sense, with a hammer and anvil, in the artistic sense, and how new technology is changing the manufacturing of metal. Modern blacksmithing in the traditional sense can be a hobby as well as a profession, and there are a few pros out there who keep the art of traditional forging alive. Laura Lee Sims, author of The Backyard Blacksmith, writes, "I incorporate traditional blacksmithing techniques and the use of modern equipment. Daily household items such as lamps, kettles, and vases, all fashioned by hand into beautiful and intricate forms, gave me an understanding that art could be functional." Her book is one of the many introductory books teaching newcomers how to turn a love for smithing into a hobby or a profession. Darren Bush is another professional in this realm of metal, whose basic, straight-to-the-point tips on blacksmithing inspire many new smiths. He breaks the art down as, you need 4 basic things: a thing to heat your work, a thing to hold your work, a thing to put under your work, and a thing to apply forces to your work, and later explains that the process is slightly more complicated. Similar to the making of traditional equipment, metalworking can also be used to create sculptures. One of the most prominent figures in this field is Pat Downing, a smith who picked up blacksmithing at 51 years old and in 10 years became one of the best-known metalworking artists in the world. He explains the process. For my artwork, I mostly use a technique called fold forming, which is an origami-like process folding metal into dramatic shapes. Depending on the size of the piece and the kind of metal, you can use just about any tools to manipulate the metal into the shape you want. I use everything from traditional handmade tools to power tools until I get exactly the shape I'm looking for, often using heat up to 1800 degrees, depending on the metal. To finish a piece, I use materials such as ammonia, salt, and acids, or sometimes just heat to create vibrant colors. Although the popularity of traditional blacksmithing is not growing, the use of metalworking as an art form is on the rise. Finally, there is a metalworking in the most modern sense, using advanced machinery and computer technology to replicate or create any possible metal piece needed. This is best described by first-class airman John Linsmeyer at the McConnell Air Force Base, who fabricates metal pieces for military aircraft. He explains that whether it's something small like a stuck screw or a vital part of an aircraft that's not in production anymore, we can make it. Name any metal component on any plane and we can make it. His work is so different from traditional blacksmiths in the way that he uses 3D computer models, hardness testers, and other state-of-the-art equipment to be as precise and consistent as possible. Through the manufacturing of basic tools, intricate sculptures, or precise pieces, blacksmithing is alive and growing in the modern day.
Tools, weapons, and other appliances were once much simpler than today. Starting as early as 10,200 BCE, the Neolithic era saw the forging of humans' first tools. It was until around 3000 BCE that the world saw some of the first tin bronzes, and the Iron Age followed soon after. Many areas actually jumped straight from the Neolithic tools to iron, being geographically divided from other areas that were quickly learning the methods of alloys and metals. These first discoveries actually occurred in Africa. The Bronze Age that is typically referenced, the one that occurred in Europe, happened over 1,000 years later. The general starting era for the Iron Age is around 1000 BCE, although some noteworthy historians believe it started far before the main Bronze Age. Some of the most intricate, strong, and durable iron and steel crafting came from areas other than those outlined in a typical ancient history book. For example, President Herbert Hoover, before becoming president, worked as a miner and metallurgical engineer. He was responsible for the discovery of an iron plate in the Great Pyramid of Khafre. This building is noted as having been built around 3700 BCE, far before any other proposed introduction to this era. As far as steels go, there are two areas that can claim to have the best steel in the realm of history. The first, and probably more commonly known, are Damascus steels, usually used in swords such as scimitars. The second is a katana, a curved blade used by the samurai. The Damascus swords are even more curved than katanas, but both are curved due to the ultra-high carbon steel being used in the exterior of the blade, while lesser carbon steel is used as an inlay. Both of these steel forging methods relied on primitive phase diagrams that indicated when the steel changed form and, in layman's terms, became stronger or weaker. Yet another process for carbon steel, and one that predates most other methods, is that of the Hayas, an African tribe in Tanzania. These steelsmiths had a very intricate process of creating their carbon steel. Using a cone-shaped kiln, the iron would be placed inside over charcoal and charred swamp reeds. The 8 men would stand around the kiln and hand pump air into it, resulting in the hottest steel forging process up to modern times. It is important to note many of these processes because they indicate how much of a culture has been lost in the face of modern technology. The Hayas were put out of business by European steel forgers with a much cheaper and not as high quality process. Swords were replaced with guns and bombs.
Now, with all the history and cultural aspects of blacksmithing and metalworking in mind, the chemistry and sciences behind what is actually occurring during metalworking is incredibly important in order to create a more profound understanding of and appreciation for the art. From different techniques and their effects to lattice structures to the effects of certain elements in the metals, metals are one of the most versatile compounds in the world due to the numerous changes that occur within them. First, the most important aspect of metals are the fundamental repeating units that make them up, lattice structures. In an interview with Mr. Lotzenheiser, he explains the basics of unit cells and their importance in metals.
Okay, lattice structures, especially when you're talking about just plain metals, is really how the atoms are packed together. They can be packed really close together, they can be packed a little bit further apart, more gappiness in a sense, but for the most part metals form various shapes, which are called unit cells, that repeat themselves over and over. And what I have in front of me are 3 common unit cells that metals generally take on as far as when they pack themselves together. Okay, this one right here is known as a body-centered cubic, and you see that it's cubic, but there's body-centered means there's an atom stuck in the center with 8 neighbors, you know what I'm saying, kind of around this thing. Okay, this one is what's known as face-centered. Okay, and you can see it's different. Okay, you can't quite see the inside of this. But if I were to take a saw and saw straight down through here, all these 5 atoms right here would be like on the face. Especially this one right here is why it's called face-centered, and if you look at it, it's kind of cubic as well. There's also another one that's known as hexagonal close-packed, and it kind of just it looks a lot different than what these other ones do. So these 3 different forms right here are how atoms can pack themselves together, kind of depending upon the size of the atom and how close together they get. Now, if you change like from one phase, these are really what's called a phase. If you change from one phase to another, you vary the properties quite a bit. And so this actually, if you look at this one right here happens to be that face center cubic that we have. And so if you have a face center cubic, it kind of goes apart like this, but they can slide apart from each other like this. And this kind of gives the properties of like malleability. You can work with these types of metals very easily because of the face center structure that they have.
Next, an important aspect of metals is the compounds with which they are produced. When adding certain compounds, they'll have one of 2 effects. They'll either add interstitially or substitutionally. When the added element is very small in comparison to the metal, it's added in the gaps of the unit cells, which is an interstitial addition. The best example of interstitial addition would be carbon and iron, which together make up steel. When the 2 elements are close to the same size, the element takes the place of a carbon in the united cell, which is a substitution addition. Interstitial additions tend to affect the physical properties of a metal, how tough, how hard, and how strong they are, while substitution additions affect the chemical properties, specifically what the metal reacts with. With the understanding of lattice structures and unit cells, and their effects on the properties of metal, another important aspect of metalworking are the techniques used and their effects on the metal. One important technique is quenching, which is when metal is heated up to the suitable temperature and then quenched in water or oil to harden to full hardness. This process rapidly cools the metal, trapping it in the state it's at the time of cooling. This process can also force elements to stay within a metal even when they would typically leave. Generally, the higher temperature lattice structures and unit cells cause the metal to be much harder but more brittle, which causes the metal to have less flexibility and thus break more easily. The other most important technique is tempering, which is basically a combination of quenching and reheating. This process initially has the full hardness of a quenched metal, but after reheating the metal, the lattice structures are able to return to their proper states. This relieves stress and makes the metal softer, but provides flexibility that would not otherwise be available to the metal. Overall, there are numerous ways to change the properties of a metal, all of which can be explained thoroughly through science.